It's my pleasure to introduce our luncheon keynote speaker. I'm going to admit something. In designing or thinking about who some of these speakers were going to be for this convention, I did something kind of that Steve was doing, actually, digging through the old boxes and finding old files. And I came across, we actually have printed documents of the program of the convention going back to the 1980s. And I was looking at, well, who are some of these people? And most importantly, are they still alive? And I was, to be honest, I didn't know much about Cal Potter until I started looking into this. And I was, my admiration of him grew, beyond just the fact that he came to the Lakes Convention in the past, beyond the fact that he was a state senator who helped support the Lakes Partnership and helped support the funding for the program in Chapter 33. Cal then went on to continue in state service, even after being an elected official, and he was appointed within the Department of Public Instruction, if I have that right. And he's made a mark, I think, in the way that we use communications and our libraries across the state to make sure that no part of the state is sort of left behind in terms of technology and in terms of access to like the World Wide Web, which, just over the last 20 years, it's been something that's transformed the way we learn things and the way we use our libraries. So I think it's so great to see someone doing that type of work. And then I learned that he got involved with Common Cause of Wisconsin and that he wanted to dedicate some of his time and energy to helping the state of Wisconsin think about what I'm calling, I guess, our political infrastructure, sort of the rules of the road and the pieces that are easy to take for granted when we as voters believe it's just our responsibility to go to the polls every once in a while and cast a vote and then we're done with it. It turns out there's a lot more to it than that. So I'm glad that Cal can come and talk about sort of his relationship with the partnership in the past, but also sort of some comments for us to think about going forward in the future. So without further ado, I'll give the mic over to Senator Cal Potter.
Thank you very much. It's very nice to be here. Yes, the rumors of my death are greatly exaggerated. I feel I'm sort of a continuation of the panel that was this morning. We had three gray-haired guys over there, older guys, and I'm old and still not falling apart, but I'm an older fella who's the pre-PowerPoint era. And I also have a closet full of slide cassettes, just like Lowell. How did I get involved in this? Well, I began my work career as a teacher at Plymouth High School, government teacher, and I decided to run for the legislature. I was elected in November of 1974. My district was rural Sheboygan County. And at that time, the U.S. government and the Department of Transportation was proposing I-43. From Milwaukee to Green Bay, parallel to an existing two-lane road, 141. Well, a new road was going to cut through all these farms. And the Klessig family is a rather large family, and they have a number of farms in Calumet County and in Manitowoc County. And I went to right after I was elected in November of 74, I was invited to this farmers gathering of course, persons that were not too happy about the fact that I-43 is going to be built. And in that storage machine shed with torpedo heaters going and so on, I was in the midst of a bunch of farmers, and somebody came up to me by the name of Lowell Klessig, who was there because his uncle's farm, Ed Klessig's farm, was one of those that was going to be impacted. And in the course of our conversation, he said, I'm going to come and see you in a few weeks with some legislation. And lo and behold, in January of 1975, he was in my office with Chapter 33 language that he would allow me to introduce, and that was the beginning of a long friendship and an association with Wisconsin Lakes. And I appreciated his work over the years, and I appreciated his friendship. In the few minutes that I have been given here, it'll be about 15, 20 minutes, I'd like to share with you some thoughts about the political structure. And I do it based on my 24 years in the legislature, as well as my work with Common Cause, and what I have observed as a citizen of the changes that have occurred since I left the legislature. And there have been big changes. And I want to tell you about this, not from a so-called partisan point of view, but the more you're aware of the political structure, the more you can lobby in a savvy way, in a sophisticated way, that you're not the country bumpkin that maybe some legislator thinks they can, pull the wool over your eyes. And so my thoughts today are to share with you 4 things that I think you ought to be aware of in this political climate that have brought about change. Now, politics have always changed. I mean, we look at the map today and we look at red states and we look at blue states. If you were to look at that same map that we commonly look at today in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, you'll see quite a different arrangement of color. The South is not red, but at the South at that time was blue. And why? Well, because Abe Lincoln was a Republican and the South voted Democrat, and the whites in the South were conservative Democrats. They were called Dixiecrats, but they gave Roosevelt and Truman and all Kennedy and everybody else fits over those years, but they were in the majority column as Democrats. Then in the 1920s, if you really want to read some interesting stories about the floods that occurred on the Mississippi River and the reluctance of very conservative administrations during the 1920s, the black community started not voting Republican, but started voting Democrat, as well as the migration to the northern industrial states. And then with the Roosevelt administration, we saw Eleanor Roosevelt particularly befriend very much the cause of African Americans. And it culminated into a real change in 1965 with the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. And if you remember the statement from Bill Moyers, Lyndon Johnson's press secretary, Lyndon Johnson, when he was signing the Civil Rights Act, he said, "With this signature, I'm kissing the South off for Democrats for at least 2 generations." Well, I think it's going to be even longer than that. But so what I'm saying, there are circumstances, there are things that happen out there that change the political table, that change the scenes. And I think there are some things that have gone on recently that you ought to be aware of because they do indeed change the political structure that we have today. One of the major items in Common Cause that I'm on that board, this is their major issue, and it's reapportionment of legislative districts. As you know, every 10 years, the legislators in states are supposed to redraw the congressional as well as the state legislative districts. What we have today is a situation that is partisanship on steroids. I mean, we've always had partisanship, but it's on steroids today. We were talking at our table before, even when I was in the legislature, Democrats and Republicans would often talk to each other. You find instances today where there's not very much communication whatsoever. Reapportionment is not been a big issue in Wisconsin because in the 1960s we had the Supreme Court decision that every district, congressional and state, had to be the same population. In other words, one man, one vote. And in 70, in 80, in 90, in 2000 in this state, we had a split government. Either Lee Dreyfus was the governor or Tommy Thompson was the governor, and there was no agreement on a bill, and it went to the courts. And the federal courts drew the districts perfectly acceptable. They didn't split communities. They didn't do it partisan-wise. They protected minority communities, particularly in Milwaukee. They did an excellent job. Well, 2010 in this state was the first time when we had a complete change and that one party controlled everything. Also, we saw a movement in the conservative community that this was an opportunity to really enhance their power. And what we saw is an investment of $30-some million in reapportionment efforts throughout this country. Democrats were really caught flat-footed. I mean, they were taken to the cleaners after the 2010 reapportionment. And so as a result, we see a system of districts today that are very gerrymandered to be the benefit of one party or the other. Now, what's wrong with this? Well, I run into people who say, well, politicians will be politicians, who cares how they draw these districts? Well, if you're a citizen of a democracy that you want to represent the people and as many people as possible in the representation, you should be concerned about how these districts are drawn. What's wrong with political drawn districts? Well, one is that they're drawn by politicians to get themselves reelected. In other words, job security. But they do stop competitive elections. So you're not going to have a two-party debate on any issue in these districts that are drawn to be non-competitive. What does the non-competitive district do? It strengthens the party that's involved. In other words, the party politics is strengthened. Because you do not have responsiveness to the other candidate of another party, you have to be responsive to the workings of your own party. Safe districts force the election not to be in the general election, but in the primary. Why is that bad? Well, primaries are notorious to have maybe 15, 18% voter turnout. So you've got in a safe district now that number of percentage of people that are going to determine who's going to be the office holder, whether it's a congressional seat or a state legislative seat. Now, what that amounts to is that you've got in the Democratic Party, if you've got a district that's very tightly gerrymandered, usually the liberal section of the party has the advantage. And in a Republican Party, the advantage is in the extreme conservative. We saw it in the 6th District, and some of you who were from the 6th District where I live, we talked about that earlier today when I had a conversation with you. We saw a very conservative person come out of a multi-Republican candidate primary. That's due to the fact that that district is very solidly Republican. Also, gerrymandering of districts is bad because it cuts across community of interest. I lived in the Sheboygan area, and for decades, the Sheboygan City was all one district. People know who their legislator was. The news media market was conducive to cover that area. Today, you'll find in gerrymandered districts, communities are split, oftentimes pie-shaped. And as a result, that's gerrymandering, and it does make it very difficult for the electorate. Second big issue that Common Cause is concerned with, and you ought to be aware of, is that today, money in politics has gotten to be outrageous. My first assembly race in 1974, cost me $3,000. My Senate race in 1990 was $43,000. Today, a state Senate race in Wisconsin, including independent expenditures, is probably in several $1 million. That's what has happened in a few years. Result of court decisions. The most notorious court decision is Citizens United. Corporations are deemed as people. Large unregulated contributions are considered free speech. And so we have new superstars that are actually influencing our politics today. And we have people like the Koch brothers and Edelman, and all these, Sheldon Adelman, all these different people that have come on the scene. What does this mean? It means that money is controlling a lot of things. It means that independent groups oftentimes spend more money on candidate elections than the parties and the candidates themselves do. Money buys access, it buys allegiance, it determines agendas. Candidates know where the money comes from, probably the people do not. I hear people who say, oh, money doesn't make any difference, and there are candidates who say that. From my years of being in system, the politeness I can say is baloney. Disclosure is probably the biggest thing that Common Cause is looking for right now, unless these court decisions are reviewed or reversed, and we have legislation to address these issues. The best we can hope for is that we try to identify who's giving what, how much, where it's all coming from, so the electorate at least knows. Third big change, and this is not a Common Cause issue, but it's an issue that I observe as a citizen, and I see it interacting with the public, and that's the fragmentation of the news media. Many of people of my generation, the question was always asked, do you know where you were when John Kennedy was shot? And most people of my generation would say, absolutely. Everybody remembered. Well, why was that? Partly because there were only 3 networks, and you watched Walter Cronkite, David Brinkley, Chet Huntley, or Edward R. Murrow. Everybody got their news from a very narrow spectrum. Well, today, hundreds of channels, the internet, social media, and the demise of newspapers. Coverage of a lot of your issues today, particularly in the conservation area, isn't what it used to be. There used to be a Milwaukee Sentinel, a Milwaukee Journal, Cap Times, State Journal. Everyone had their own reporters in the Capitol. I remember those days. They competed with each other. They did detailed reporting. They did investigative reporting. Those days and very much are gone because of staffing issues and money shortages that newspapers today have. People also watch their viewpoint preferences. Conservatives watch Fox News, liberals watch MSNBC, and today we have talk show hosts that politicians die to get on, and they wouldn't say anything or do anything that is going to alienate people. I mean, God forbid if you were to be criticized as a conservative by Rush Limbaugh or Hannity. Another fourth issue that I think has impacted political behavior is voters today vote in blocks and single issue voting more than ever. I mean, we know that in the past, Democrats would have labor unions on their side, business people would have the Republican Party as their kind of sort of spokesman. But today, we find people who vote guns, they vote abortion issue, they vote gay marriage, they vote school vouchers, and that's what they vote. And this, I think, has been a very detrimental part of I think, the electorate behavior. There are still groups that are still there. The Democrats still have African Americans. About 90% of African Americans vote Democratic. Labor unions still vote very heavily Democratic, but labor unions are only 12% of the workforce. In 1968 was the zenith of the labor movement, and labor unions were made up about 39% of the workforce. Look at legislative agendas today, whether it's religious freedom legislation or abortion legislation or gun legislation. Why is it there? Why is it fast-tracked? It's allegiance, it's the coalition of the parties and so on, and putting these interest groups in their camp, and it's, I think, been detrimental to the consideration in a broad, general, holistic view of addressing issues. So let me just complete my remarks by saying, what should you take from my comments here and an understanding of these changes? One, I think you have to realize that the political structure today in this country as a generalization, as a whole, is dominated by more conservatives than before and by party politics more than ever. And when you're dealing with people who are more conservative, their viewpoint, they're not fans always of government. They're not always fans of regulation. And they're not always fans of taxes. I remember in the 1980s, the early 1980s, well, when Tony Earl was governor, we ran out of resources to fund the university, the DNR, public education, and we had to face what we were going to do. Do we take a meat axe to all these nice programs, or do we raise taxes? Some of us, and the majority of us, came to the conclusion we needed to move the sales tax in Wisconsin from 4% to 5%. I took holy hell for that for many years after that vote and after that decision. But that was in a legislature that was more conservative. What you need to do as a person who realizes the political world today is you need to develop a personal relationship with a legislator more than ever. They need to know who you are as an individual. They need to know what you do, what's your lake district, what's your lake association. You need to tell them very explicitly why you need help from government. Your support that you'll get from them will be because you have an acquaintance, a friendship, not because you have money, not because you control legislative districts, not because you can get news coverage of what your plight is. Letters are not enough. It has to be that personal relationship. You have to have repeat, I think, invites to your lake, to your situation, to your meetings, to whatever you're dealing with, so that what you have is a legislator who gets so attuned to what you need and who you are that they will not be able to look you in their eye if they turn around and put the screws to you. It's as simple as that. It's that personal relationship. I also think that coalitions are very important. I think that has happened. With electronic media today, I think various people who are concerned about stewardship of land and water can have get some type of coalitions together that can be very effective in spite of the fact that you don't have a news media out there, a newspaper coverage of issues that are in the state budget. Don't take anything for granted that somehow these office holders know what a lake district is or a lake association or what your problems are. I always like to describe America as a culture that is made up of sports, entertainment, and consumerism. Not civic literacy, not stewardship of land and water, but I think those three factors very much dominate American culture. And so legislators come out of that same culture. And I think it's very important that if you really want to have success in this type of political environment, I think that personal relationship with the elected officials is the way that you can deal with it. So let me stop there. We have a few minutes for questions, and Eric said that'd be what we should be doing. So what happens when people eat before they...
I have a question, and then we can I'll come over to Bob as I ask it. And that's the economics of water. In your experience as a legislator and decision maker, how has learning about the economics of water in the context, for example, we have townships with second homeowners paying 50 to 90% of the tax base to keep that town running. Can you talk about the economics of water in the context of your work?
If you're trying to get support of a legislator, I think one of the things that you're competing against is the fact that today, amongst the conservative community, and they dominate the legislature, voting for a tax increase is a very difficult issue. And so I think it's an argument to be made, but I think, again, that the personal relationship you have with, you're dealing with your local unit of government, you are the unit of government very close to the people. Water is an economic resource. It is something that does benefit Wisconsin in many ways. I think it's an argument to be made, but you're always up against that issue of just so many resources to go around. And as a result, when you have a very conservative legislature, they're going to divvy it up according to where they think it's most important. And I think making the economic argument is good, but I also think just the whole area of stewardship of land and water. There are a number of facets and avenues in your argument to legislators why you're worthy of support, of financial support and other support in the legislature.
To your point of the importance of creating a relationship with your legislator, knowing that they're busy, they have thousands of constituents that they need to serve. Any suggestions on how to respectfully or respectful of their time create that relationship with them?
Well, I think if you have people who get into politics, I think, have a certain level of ego. They want to meet their constituents. They want to be visible. They're not shrinking violets. And I think if you have a meeting, an activity, something going on, I think they welcome that invite into their local district. I would not be concerned about the fact that they've got too much to do, because if they wouldn't be with you, they'd be with somebody else. So you might as well join the competition for their time and energy. You're more worthy than anybody else, I would say. So I wouldn't don't hold back at all. They're not that busy. They're not that busy. Especially when you look at the productivity of their legislative agendas. I mean, we have had record low production out of Congress and out of the state legislature. I mean, it is embarrassingly low. When I was in the legislature, it was common, to have several thousands of bills and hundreds that were passed. I mean, it's anemic what they do today. And a lot of it is due to the fact that it's a conservative environment, and passing laws has sometimes cost money, and the conservatives will not doesn't look at the things as much as in productivity as liberals would look at it.
All right, please join me in thanking Cal Potter for their time.